right, which is devoted to pilgrimage. The first speaker is Mirjam Lücking, who is an anthropologist working on Islam in Indonesia and on transnational connections between Indonesia and the Middle East. For her PhD, which she received in Freiburg, she researched how Indonesians relate to the Arab world, looking at examples of pilgrimage and later migration from Indonesia to the Arabian Peninsula. Currently, she's working on Muslim Christian pilgrimage tourism from Indonesia to Israel and the Palestinian territories. She's a postdoctoral fellow here, mostly at the Department of Asia Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and a member of the Center for the Study of Conversion here at the Korean University. In October 2019, she will join the Martin Buber Society of Fellows at the Hebrew University, which is marvelous.
Thank you very much, Uri.
I just want to, to explain, we're going to have all three talks in succession. It's working. We'll have all three talks in succession, and then we'll have the comment, and then we'll open it up for comments and questions afterwards.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I will be talking about the Mount of Olives, and as you can see in this picture doesn't show the Mount of Olives. This picture shows a group of Indonesian tourists that I have been accompanying now for almost 2 years. I mean, not all of the time, every now and then. And they are looking from the Mount of Olives towards the old city of Jerusalem. And this is in fact how many tourists experience the Mount of Olives, as a viewpoint from where they see the spectacular view of the old city of Jerusalem with the most important sacred sites of Judaism, Christianity and Islam. Most importantly, the golden dome of the rock that no tourist wants to miss out in the photos of Jerusalem. So maybe tomorrow you will have a chance to take your picture of Jerusalem from this spot. But I want to turn our attention to the Mount of Olives because it's actually quite interesting to look at it. So now you have a picture of the Mount of Olives. In 2016, before I joined the Center for the Study of Conversion, ORA LIMOR and Eyal Ben Eliyahu gave a comprehensive talk on the Mount of Olives. It's accessible on YouTube. I recommend watching it. The Mount of Olives has a very complex history, and Ora, you and Eliyahu, you talked about sharing sacred space, competing over sacred space, and also the question of conversion of sacred space. So it is a very complex topic, and I'm not an expert on the Mount of Olives. What I'll be talking about is space as relational space, according to the definition of Martina Löw, who also refers to Lefebvre, that we've heard his definition of space before, with a focus on experience. So the understanding that space is not only the physical structures of space that influence human behavior, but the way that we experience space also depends on our imaginations and how we want to see this space, how we move in this space, how embodiment plays a role in the space. And I look at this especially in the context of pilgrimage, so people coming with a specific purpose to this space and defining this space as their sacred pilgrimage destination. Besides all the interesting aspects of sharing sacred space and competing over its ownership, an aspect that turned out to be central in my observations was separation. Mm-hmm. And the aspect of separation, I mean, as Uri said in his introduction, I research about both Muslim and Christian tourism. So there is a topic of separation between Muslim and Christian itineraries and Muslim and Christian narratives. But there is also a separation between sacred tourist space. I say tourist space because we know from Victor Turner that every pilgrim is also a tourist. And thinking about separation, we can actually learn a lot from tourist studies about themed environments and the environmental bubble in Eric Cohen's words. So this is the Indonesians that I'm accompanying. This part of the Mount of Olives is a very small part of a larger research on tourism from Indonesia to Jerusalem. which in Muslim tours it's a pilgrimage to Palestine and also promoted as solidarity tourism to support the Palestinian people. In this picture you also see two women raising funds for the Palestinian people. And on the Christian side, it is connected to, it began more as an equivalent of the Hajj, of Christian people finding their prestigious pilgrimage in pilgrimages that are called Holy Land pilgrimages. And in the advertisements that you see here, and also the tour t-shirt, you see the adoption of Jewish symbols, the Magen David, the menorah, in the name of the travel agency also. So it's not to an extent that what Gideon presented yesterday, but there is also Christian Zionists in Indonesia. And this idea of taking sides in the Israel-Palestine conflict in the context of tourism is what I'm researching about, and I'm also researching about how this is related to a general commercialization and politicization of religious affiliation in Indonesia. So this is just the background. I'm talking more on the Christian experience today. This is a map of the Mount of Olives. It's a map taken from OpenStreetMaps, where it's a nice feature that the name of streets and locations is always written in the language of the country. So you see on the left side a lot of Hebrew, and then on the right side some Arabic. So you see that the Mount of Olives is located on the edge to the West Bank. And it's, you might be familiar also with this geography, that it is east of the old city of Jerusalem, and that the western slope of the Mount of Olives is hosting the most important religious and sacred sites, the Jewish cemetery, numerous churches, chapels and monasteries, also some mosques and graves of Muslim saints. And then the top of the hill is a residential area. It's called Atur, and it borders to the northern part of what is also part of the mountain ridge of the Mount of Olives, and known as Mount Scopus, and it's home to the Hebrew University where I'm based at. I first saw the Mount of Olives through the window of tourist coaches when I accompanied Indonesian travel groups. Most Christian Indonesian groups follow a similar itinerary. The spiritual experience starts on the bus. Indonesian church songs, prayers and sermons fill the time from the hotel to the Mount of Olives, which is often the first stop in the morning. When the view of Jerusalem comes in sight, the guide or the group's spiritual leader takes the microphone and starts to give explanations about the area, or gives a short sermon or reads a passage from the Bible. All Indonesian groups are guided by both a spiritual and organizational leader from Indonesia, and they also have an Israeli or Palestinian local licensed tour guide in addition. So 3 people guiding this group. And the groups are often groups that come from the same region, sometimes even from the same congregation, traveling with their own priest or minister. In the dense itinerary of Indonesian pilgrimage tours, so these tours go usually for 10 days, they start in Egypt, go to Israel and Palestine, and then end in Jordan, so 10 days being very packed. The Mount of Olives tour takes half a day, and it's usually a relaxing beginning of the Jerusalem part of the pilgrimage. It is relaxing because the group can spend some time together in the air-conditioned bus, which is very different from the experience in the packed street of the old city on the Via Dolorosa. They comfortably climb the Mount of Olives and enjoy the stunning view of the city. Also an opportunity to have an experience of community on the bus. And I was sharing this experience when I accompanied Indonesian pilgrims. Then I had the brilliant idea of thinking that I want to move to my research site. So I'm living in Tel Aviv, far away from the sacredness of Jerusalem, but I thought it might be nice to spend a couple of nights every week in the research area. So I decided to, like half a year ago, in January, to rent a second apartment on the Mount of Olives in the Palestinian neighborhood Atur, and also being close to the university, being close to my research site. Ironically, residence in Atur at the Mount of Olives did not bring me any closer to my research participants. even though being now physically located in the research site, in fact, I felt further away. I could not share the pilgrimage experience. I was hanging around at the sacred sites, talking occasionally to pilgrims, but never really fully getting into their experience, and also seeing the area with very different eyes. So now, not seeing them from the windows of the tourist coaches, but seeing them from the window of local buses that I would take to go up and down the Mount of Olives. Realizing how detached the tourist sacred space is from the residential reality at the Mount of Olives is why I include residents' life worlds here, and maybe if there are some more experiences about this, I'm very interested, or this made me interested in the general relation between sacred space and residential areas, and how residents are included in sacred space or excluded from it. On the Mount of Olives, the separation between sacred tourist spaces and the profane everyday reality of residents coincides with the separation between Israeli and Palestinian residents of Jerusalem. As an example, Jerusalem has two bus systems. The Oded buses that you can see in all of Israel, and where you can use this green Raf-Gaf card that you see here in the picture, and the Palestinian buses that have their own transportation card that are only used by Palestinians, that operate in East Jerusalem and towards the West Bank checkpoints. From the Palestinian point of view, East Jerusalem is annexed, occupied territory. East Jerusalemite residents are not granted Israeli citizenship. They hold ID cards and they can take part in municipal elections. They are under the administration of the Jerusalem municipality, but they are not Israeli citizens, as in the example of Asbi. They are also not Palestinian citizens. They do not have Palestinian papers. In fact, they have Jordanian travel documents. But these documents are also without a citizenship number. So apart from the separation of Palestinian East Jerusalem and Jewish Israeli West Jerusalem, this separation of East and West is coinciding with the separation of sacred space and of profane residents' everyday space. While for pilgrims the bus is a safe and maybe also sacred space, so I think that's an interesting overlapping aspect about the safe and the sacred space. For pilgrims, for residents, being on the bus makes them aware of separation and also of staying put. So when for the pilgrims, being on the bus is moving, being a pilgrim, being also somehow cosmopolitan, for residents, being on the bus can mean to be stuck in traffic, but it's also a symbol of being stuck with the Palestinian situation, of having difficulties to travel abroad, having to go to the airport in Amman, difficulties to invite relatives from Gaza, the West Bank, and Jordan, who, different from tourists that the residents see all the time in their neighborhood, cannot visit Jerusalem so easily. The tourist buses often come via the road from Mount Scopus. It's a panorama view road along the university. Then there is a small transition between Mount Scopus and Atur, which is the lands of the Lutheran World Federation and the Augusta Victoria Hospital. And as you can see here in the pictures, this passage is defined by fences which prevent me and other residents of Atur to walk the short distance between the university and Atur. Some Indonesians comment on garbage and chaos on the streets when they enter Atur, but a lot of them also do not really see the difference. I think, Jackie, you mentioned once that tourist buses also have the seats and the windows are higher, and they are not on street level, so you can see the panorama view of Jerusalem, but you do not see what's going on the streets. The walking path between the Mount of Olives and the Hebrew University leads through one of the two Jewish settlements on the Mount of Olives, and it's actually promoted as a Mount of Olives walk, passing from the settlements along the Mormon University to Mount Scopus. And this orientation map shows Jewish and Christian sites, but no Muslim ones. So I mean, the Indonesians also do not take this path, and even if they would, they also wouldn't see much of the reality of the Palestinian residents. They pass through the main road of Atur, which is sometimes a scene of car and motorcycle races or horse rides, as you see here. It's also unfortunately a scene of clashes, even among other Palestinian East Jerusalemite residents. Atur has a bad reputation. Some taxi drivers are shocked when I tell them where I want to get off. Atur residents themselves acknowledge that there are problems regarding fanatism, criminality, drug trade and garbage, and this latter aspect is what they explain with the lack of services from the government, actually feeling betrayed because of having to pay the highest rate of city tax in Jerusalem and not having a feeling of not receiving appropriate services in return. However, all of this is invisible to the tourists, and if there is any comment about the area at all, it would be a racist comment about Arab people being dirty and chaotic. The first stop for the Indonesian pilgrims, the Indonesian Christian pilgrims, is the Chapel of the Ascension, which I think was briefly mentioned by Yamit, relating to the footprint in the chapel. So this is, according to the Christian belief, where Jesus ascended to heaven, and there is a footprint that Indonesian pilgrims love to touch. So they would usually enter the chapel and have a prayer together, reading from the Bible, and then all of them, one by one, would go to touch this stone. And Indonesians love to touch stones, so this is, yeah, I think interesting with regard to your research. In fact, this is a very interesting, it's a very interesting site, and if you go there tomorrow, you will see that it is a site that has experienced conversion and also multi-religious pilgrimage. It is now administered by the Islamic Waqf. It's attached to a mosque in which there is the grave of Rabia al-Adawiyya, and there is also a Muslim belief of the ascension to heaven. And I heard that the second footprint is actually located in Al-Aqsa Mosque. So this is a very interesting, again, with regarding the complex history of the Mount of Olives, but the Indonesians, they come, they read from their own Bible in their own language, sing the songs from their own church. When they walk out of the chapel, they even have the opportunity to purchase a book about the Holy Land in Indonesian, the book that you see here about Tanah Suci. After a short walk from the chapel, the pilgrims reach the Roman Catholic Church Paternoster. Again, the pilgrims assemble and pray together, commemorate how Jesus was teaching his disciples how to pray the Lord's Prayer. A special attraction in the Church of the Paternoster are stone panels that show the Lord's Prayer in languages from all over the world. Not only in Indonesian language, but even in other languages from Indonesia, like Javanese. And this plate for Javanese, the Lord's Prayer in Javanese language, has actually been donated by an Indonesian travel agency, which also shows how travel agencies take part in designing the sacred space on the Mount of Olives and in personalizing it. And it's a welcome opportunity, a favored opportunity to take pictures. Even though the next destination is not far away, most Indonesian pilgrims get back on the bus to drive towards the panorama viewpoint above the Jewish cemetery, passing by one of the Jewish settlements on the Mount of Olives. And again, they usually do not notice that all of a sudden there is an Israeli flag and that the settlements look very different from the Palestinian residential area. So the two settlements, Beit Orod and Ma'ale HaZeitim, were established in 2011 and 2010, and they define their aim, I'm quoting from their website as follows, quote, Beit Orod represents the first living Jewish presence in 2 millennia on Har HaZeitim, the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem, filling an integral role in the reclamation and development of crucial historic areas of the Jewish capital. By virtue of its location and philosophy, Beit Orod is at once defending the sacred traditions of our nation, the physical security of Eretz Israel, and the integrity of Yerushalayim, the undivided capital of Israel and of the Jewish people. End of quote. So for, the establishment of the settlements was related also to a lot of aggression and conflict between Palestinian residents and settlers. cemetery, which is so important for these settlers, is located right under the panorama viewpoint. And it's quite interesting that even the Indonesian tourists that have a Zionist agenda and that want to support the Jewish people as God's chosen people and feel connected to them, do not pay much attention to the cemetery. When they arrive at the panorama viewpoint, they focus on taking pictures, which is the major aim for them, and they usually bring banners to take pictures with a banner of themselves. The guides informed me that both theologically and practically it makes a lot of sense to start on the Mount of Olives. And as you can see here, there is also some street vendors try to use the opportunity to offer their products. They bring donkeys and camels for the tourists to make special pictures. And this is maybe the only interaction between Palestinian residents and tourists, even though most of the tourists are discouraged from purchasing souvenirs from the street vendors, as the guides and the travel agencies would take them to souvenir shops where the shopkeepers speak Indonesian, and of course where the travel agency gets a commission. So then the pilgrims descend from the panorama viewpoint down the slope, what I said before, which is the sacred area on the Mount of Olives. They usually never see the other side of the Mount of Olives, the eastern side of the Mount of Olives, which is home to the larger part of the residential area and which is at the edge, as I said before, to the west bank. So in the upper small picture you can see the wall, the separation wall to the west bank. Yes? Okay. So I'm summing up. I wanted to say something about Dominus Flevit and also about the Church of All Nations. Summarizing, I can say that these two places are again places that are very much Indonesianized, that where the tour guides that come there several times and also the priests say they feel home in these places. You also see that there is leaflets in Indonesian language. They have a connection to the Franciscan order administering this church and hold a holy mass in Indonesian language. So they come there again and again. They also know this from other pilgrims that have been there before, and it's making the sacred space their own. So, and again, another stone to touch. Just very briefly on the Muslim groups. The Muslim groups, quite interestingly, even though they promote these tours as solidarity tourism for Palestine, they have no idea about the reality of Palestinian residents on the Mount of Olives. If they visit the Mount of Olives at all, they just go briefly to the tomb of Rabia al-Adawiyya at the Chapel of the Ascension, and they take a group picture, again with this banner that I mentioned before, very similar to the Christian groups. So all of this is to say that in the marketing strategies of Indonesian tourists, the idea of taking sides and the separation between the Jewish Israel and Muslim Palestine is very strong. When the Indonesian tourists come here, it doesn't seem to play any role, and in all my in all the tours where I accompanied people and in the interviews I made, I realized that none of them has any personal contact to the people on the ground. But I also found this interesting from a more, we are talking about sacred space and what defines sacred space, that in this specific case, the sacred space is defined by the experience, the Indonesianized experience. So the pilgrimage experience is completely traveling microcosmos or an environmental bubble, as again Eric Cohen said. What happens from within the group, and maybe the most sacred space is actually the bus. So we could also think about the bus as a safe and sacred space, where they can experience the comunitas in peace, and also in these churches and chapels where all the other groups have been before. The sacred tourist spaces are very much separated from the profane residential space, and because of this separation, I was also methodologically not able to get a better insight from living in Atur. It only made me aware of how much sacred space is defined by joining, sharing the experience of the group. And for the case of Jerusalem, the separation between sacred tourist spaces and profane residential space also means that the tourists do not see the separation between east and west, or basically keeping the political out of the religious course. Yeah.
Thank you, Mirjam. Okay, there you go. Okay, thank you, Mirjam. We proceed promptly with Catalin-Stefan Popa, who is a Syriac and Oriental scholar and is now currently a postdoctoral fellow here at the Center for the Study of Conversion at Ben Gurion University. He earned his PhD from Göttingen in 2016 with a dissertation on Yihus. This dissertation was published as a book, and this book was awarded the Nicolae Iorga Prize for History by the Romanian Academy in 2018. Catalin is now working on his second book project, Habilitation, dealing with the historical, theological, and cultural relationship of Syriac Christians with the Holy City of Jerusalem from the rise of Islam until the end of the Mongol Empire, and I suspect that the talk today emerges from this research.
Thank you so much for the presentation. My paper focuses on the first mēmrā of the Ethicon, a book written by Gregory bar Hebraeus, a 13th century Syriac author. A chapter of this mēmrā is devoted to the pilgrimage to Jerusalem as understood by Syriac Christians. First of all, I will make a brief introduction about the author and his writing, but before this, please take a look on the slides in order to frame the Syriac church space. So Gregory bar Hebraeus was born in 1226 in a Jewish family of Melitene and was Christianized with the name of Yohanan. After a hermetic life in the area of Antioch in 1246, he was consecrated as bishop of Gubas and Lakabin. In 1253, he was advanced to the more important diocese of Aleppo. Later on, he was elected as Mafrian. Mafrian was the leader of the Syriac Orthodox Church in the East Syriac territory, in the former Persian space. He died in 1286 in Maragah, having his resting place in the monastery of Marmatai near Mosul. He was one of the most representative figures of Syriac Renaissance, writing different books, devoting himself to an intensive literary activity until the end of his life. With his encyclopedic spirit, bar Hebraeus well represented his church in the Syriac Renaissance, when the Syriac Christianity once again systematized centuries of heritage in the 13th century. He was proficient in theological as well as philosophical, philological and astronomical issues and wrote more than 30 books in Syriac and Arabic. The Muslims accepted his literary abilities, requesting him to translate his famous chronography into Arabic. The Syriac text of Ethicon is preserved in no less than 42 Syriac manuscripts and other 17 Arabic manuscripts. These books were edited twice. The first edition was made by Paul Bergian, and the second one by Chichek, which is a recopy of handwritten in West Syria of Bergian edition, and we have a recently new publication in the series Bar Hebraeus Cluster Publications by Gorgias Press in 2015. Although Bar Hebraeus' Book of Ethics or Ethicon was edited as early as 1898, it has been given little attention by the scholarly world. One of the reasons might be that the work as a whole was never translated into a Western language. Arend Jan Wenksik, a Dutch Semitic and Syriac scholar, published an English translation of 2 chapters as an appendix to his translation of the Book of Dove in 1919. The Ethicon was written for novices and solitaries, but also for lay people. It contains 4 mēmrā, 4 books. Our interest is focused on the first mēmrā. This was edited and translated for the first time by Herman Toile. The mēmrā is divided in 9 chapters, dealing with ascetical practices such as the manner of praying, reading spiritual books, reciting psalm, fasting, living in seclusion, and pilgrimage. Our interest is focused on chapter 9, on going to Jerusalem, including 5 sections. The first section on the opinion that exists on worshiping in Jerusalem, the second one on the opinions that exist concerning residing in Jerusalem, the third one on the canons that should be observed on the way to Jerusalem, the fourth section on the canons that should be observed in Jerusalem, and the last section on the meditation of the intellect at the places of Jerusalem. In the first section of this mēmrā, the author devotes his discourse to presenting 2 different opinions: people ardent to see the holy city, and another category of solitaries for whom heavenly Jerusalem was much more important. The first group characterizes Bar Hebraeus as that of prudent, educated people who do not consider it becoming to go to the holy city. And the other is that of simple common people who regard it as appropriate. End of quotation. Further on, Bar Hebraeus comments on the opinion of each group regarding the pilgrimage to Jerusalem. The group of the elevated people aim to achieve the heavenly Jerusalem to the detriment of the earthly one, said the author. Quotation: the first is the opinion of the perfect solitaries and the select doctors who only yearn to travel to Jerusalem on high. They are ready to worship God who is spirit spiritually. And because they have also heard from the word of the Father, an hour is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. They reject going to this Jerusalem on earth. End of quotation. We met here 2 biblical arguments that seem to be common to the Syriac authors who rejected the pilgrimage to Jerusalem. We also find these arguments in a much earlier writing of an East Syriac patriarch named Israel the first to the end of the 6th century, when he responds to the Bishop Jacob of Dirin and argues against the wave of Syriac Christians who went to pilgrimages in Jerusalem. The patriarch's arguments being, among others, purely economic, and the increase of Syriac pilgrimages to Jerusalem threatened the Syriac churches, making them lose financial donations from the faithful people in the detriment of that from the holy places. It came out from our text that Bar Hebraeus, in order to support the vantage point of those who prefer the heavenly Jerusalem, makes appeal here to an early monastic authority without mentioning his name. But we consider the hypothesis offered by Herman Toile that this author was John of Daliata, an important East Syrian monk of the 7th century, or an apprentice of it. Although taking into account the competition in which the 2 Syriac churches were permanently, it is unlikely that Bar Hebraeus, a Syriac Jacobite, refers to an East Syriac personality. Anyway, according to Bar Hebraeus, this monastic authority invoked here answered to one of his fellows who wrote to him explaining his desire to go to Jerusalem by saying, I write to you that you are quite in error, for everybody hurries to go to Jerusalem on high. How could you hurry to live for that on earth? Such a matter is not the desire of a watchful mind. So stay in yourself, I beg you, and strive to abide in your inner self. For by this practice you will be able to resist your enemies. For you yourself are Jerusalem. And if you believe me and listen to me, and if you remain in your inner self, you will see in yourself Christ celebrating continuously. Therefore, close the gates of your city, gather your sons, and celebrate Pascha. From now on, give heed to the thoughts of your soul, which as the children, the sons of Jerusalem, likewise carry olive branches before our Savior and cry, Hosanna, in your inner self. End of quotation. So, accordingly to this monastic traditional group, which Bar Hebreus quotes here, the heavenly Jerusalem begins inside of the monk. The faith against thoughts, the liturgical celebration, and the cry of Christ as Hosanna inside of the monk seem to be the conditions for experiencing heavenly Jerusalem in the ascetic cell. The second group understood the presence in the earthly Jerusalem differently from the first group of ascetics. Tells Bar Hebreus further, namely that Jerusalem on earth is also important for the spiritual progress of both monks and Christians. And according to Bar Hebreus, this group supporting the pilgrimage to the early Jerusalem was much more numerous than the first one. It is obvious that after presenting the second group, Bar Hebreus comes with a consideration which portrays the first group of people superior to the second group, although both are accepted in his view. And quotation, and since it is not in everybody's power to stand on the high of the first lofty and sublime opinion, it is not becoming to reject the later, simply way which is easily to be trodden by many people. The more so, since it is not devoid of bearing the fruits of excellent practices and ardor for good works. And for the second attitude, namely that of people ardent to see the Jerusalem on earth, which is a defined large phenomenon among the Syrians, the author continues to offer in a second section of his chapter opinions that exist concerning residing in Jerusalem. Again, the author emphasizes two opposite options. The first is the opinion of those who consider settling down in the holy city useful and honorable. The second, consider residing there as harmful and without splendor. In order to make the reader understand both options, Bar Hebreus relies on biblical texts. On one side, for those who consider the presence in Jerusalem an honorable and useful act,